When we think of the medieval world, we imagine kings and queens sitting on thrones, making bold decisions that shape the fate of nations. It's easy to picture them draped in royal regalia, crowned and anointed, surrounded by knights and noblemen. Yet, beneath the surface of these grand palaces and powerful monarchs, a different story unfolds, one of unseen influence, subtle manipulation, and hidden power. What if the true rulers of these kingdoms weren't the ones we've been taught to admire? What if the decisions that shaped the course of history were not made by those sitting on the throne, but by those standing just behind it, often working in the shadows, their names erased from the pages of history? Imagine for a moment that the greatest power in a kingdom was held not by a king or queen, but by those who whispered in their ears, those who advised them in secret and swayed them from behind closed doors. In the courts of medieval Europe, a handful of individuals exerted control far beyond their official titles. Figures like Queen Matilda of England, who despite never formally ruling the kingdom, managed to steer the fate of England through her immense influence. Matilda's story is a fascinating one. While the world knew of her as a claimant to the throne, few realized the extent to which she shaped English politics. Her influence went far beyond the battlefield. She worked quietly behind the scenes, forging alliances, pulling strings, and even ensuring her son's eventual ascension to the throne, all while her name remained absent from the public's eye. History had erased her pivotal role, instead focusing on the larger-than life figures of her time. And then there were the Byzantine courtiers, figures like the powerful eunuch Narses, who wielded more power than the emperor himself at times. Though he never donned a crown or inherited a kingdom, Narses controlled armies, wealth, and decisions of state, directing the fate of the Eastern Roman Empire with a subtle hand. He knew how to manipulate those around him, positioning himself at the center of the empire's complex political web. His ability to influence emperors from behind the throne shows how, often, it wasn't the monarchs who held true power, but the figures who were hidden from view, operating just beneath the surface. But why were these figures so important? Because, in a world where power was fragile and shifting, the hidden leaders were often the ones who ensured stability. They were the ones who maintained the balance of power, making strategic decisions that often went unrecognized by the public. Their influence wasn't about royal birthright or grandeur, it was about knowledge, cunning, and the ability to sway decisions without ever being in the spotlight. They understood the value of secrecy, of operating in the shadows where their true power could never be questioned. Perhaps, as history has been passed down, these individuals were intentionally overshadowed, their roles minimized, as it was easier to focus on the kings and queens, the faces that could be seen and remembered. But what if, in erasing them, we've missed something vital? These were the people who shaped the world, who steered the course of nations in ways that kings and queens could never have done alone. And as we peel back the layers of history, a pattern begins to emerge, one that challenges everything we think we know about medieval power. What if we've been looking in the wrong places all along? What if the true rulers were never crowned at all? As we uncover these invisible forces of power, we'll journey deeper into the lives of these hidden leaders. We'll see the lengths to which they went to maintain control, the hidden webs they wove, and the subtle, yet undeniable impact they had on the course of history. The question remains, what if the real history is much darker and more secretive than we've been told? What if the true puppeteers of the medieval world still remain hidden, their stories waiting to be discovered? Behind every great king, it's said, there's a great advisor. But what if those advisors were the true power behind the throne, shaping not only the policies of nations, but also the very fabric of history itself? What if some of the most influential figures in the medieval world never wore a crown, yet their decisions determined the fate of empires? Take, for example, the enigmatic figure of Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister to Louis III in France. Though he was never a king, Richelieu wielded power that rivaled that of the monarch himself. It was Richelieu who forged France's rise to preeminence in Europe, deftly manipulating political alliances, controlling the military, and even crafting policies that would steer the course of France's future. His genius lay not in brute strength or battlefield victories, but in his ability to understand the delicate web of politics and religion. With his influence, Richelieu redefined the role of monarchy in France, ensuring that Louis XIII's reign, though largely seen as one of mediocrity, would be remembered as a golden age of French diplomacy and statecraft. Richelieu was a master of subtlety. His power came not through force, but through manipulation, persuasion, and a deep understanding of human nature. He operated behind the scenes, making decisions that would change the course of European politics, all while never stepping into the public limelight. While kings like Louis XIII took the credit, it was Richelieu who pulled the strings, shaping history in ways that would have seemed impossible for a mere advisor. Then we turn to another master of hidden power, Thomas More, the English lawyer and statesman who served under King Henry VIII. More was a man of intellect and morality, whose sharp mind and unwavering principles made him an invaluable advisor to Henry. Yet, despite his devotion to his king, More's ultimate fate would reveal a darker side to his relationship with power. When Henry broke from the Catholic Church, creating the Church of England, More found himself at odds with his king. As an advisor, he had been privy to the higher secrets of the monarchy, but it was his refusal to condone Henry's actions that led to his downfall. In the end, More's moral convictions cost him his life, but it was his role as a trusted confidant of the king that allowed him to shape the political landscape of England, perhaps more than any of his contemporaries. What made these advisors so extraordinary wasn't just their intelligence or their ability to influence kings. It was their capacity to see the bigger picture. While monarchs were often caught up in the immediate struggles of their reigns, it was the advisors who could look beyond the present, anticipating future challenges and shaping long-term strategies. Whether it was Richelieu's diplomatic maneuvers in Europe or More's unwavering commitment to his faith, these men understood that true power didn't lie in the crown. It was found in the shadows, in the quiet moments of counsel and advice, in the whispered words that decided the fates of entire nations. But what was their true motivation? What drove men like Richelieu and More to wield such power from behind the throne? Was it ambition, loyalty, or a desire for something deeper? Perhaps a vision of how the world should be. Their motivations remain a mystery, but what's undeniable is their impact. These advisors may not have worn the crown, but they shaped history in ways that kings and queens could never have done alone. As we pull back the curtain on these royal counsellors, we begin to see the pattern. The true architects of fate were not always those whose names we remember. They were the advisors who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, crafting policies, shaping alliances, and influencing decisions that determined the course of history. It's a lesson that begs the question: how much of what we know about history is truly about the people in the spotlight, and how much of it was written by those who operated in the shadows? And yet, the intrigue doesn't end here. If advisors had the power to shape kingdoms, imagine what influence soldiers and mercenaries, those who held the keys to the very armies, might have had. These men, too, operated as silent power brokers, shaping the fate of nations with a sword in one hand and a deal in the other. What role did they play in the rise and fall of empires? That's where we'll turn next, uncovering how the true forces behind the thrones were not always the monarchs or their advisors, but the soldiers who fought and bled for them. In medieval times, when armies clashed and kingdoms were won or lost on the battlefield, the generals and kings often took the credit for victories and defeats. But what if the true victors were not the monarchs who commanded these armies, but the men who led them, those shadowy figures whose names were rarely spoken, yet whose decisions shaped the course of history? Consider the role of mercenaries during the Crusades. These men, often viewed as mere hired swords, were far more than just pawns in the service of kings and nobles. They were the ones who dictated the terms of engagement, the strategies of battle, and the fates of entire campaigns. One such figure was Richard the Lionheart's personal army of mercenaries, soldiers who followed him not out of loyalty to a crown or country, but for the promise of gold, glory, and a piece of the spoils. These mercenaries had the power to decide whether Richard would achieve victory or be sent home in defeat, and often their loyalty was to their paymasters, not the throne. With their swords raised high, they swayed the tides of war, while the kings and queens they served had little control over the forces they could not fully command. Even more influential were the mercenaries who came to be known as the Free Companies in medieval France. These bands of men, often disbanded soldiers with nowhere else to go, wielded considerable power as they roamed the countryside, sometimes selling their services to the highest bidder, sometimes taking matters into their own hands. One particularly infamous group, the Company of the Star, was a force to be reckoned with, moving from one battlefield to the next, their military prowess and reputation ensuring they could command the loyalty of entire armies. These mercenaries had the ability to dictate the outcomes of wars by choosing the side they fought for, or even more dangerously, by switching sides when the price was right. Their role in shaping the political landscape of medieval Europe is often overlooked, but without them, many of the key victories and defeats would have played out very differently. The power of mercenaries, however, wasn't confined solely to Europe. In the Vatican, an entirely different form of military influence was at play. The Swiss Guard, established in the early 16th century, were not just the personal bodyguards of the Pope, they were the soldiers who held the power to protect the papacy, or dismantle it, should they so choose. The Swiss Guard's loyalty to the Pope was legendary, but it was also an open secret that these highly trained soldiers were not mere followers. The mercenaries among them, many of whom came from outside the papal city, held the fate of the Catholic Church in their hands. Their strength and discipline gave them the unique ability to control or change the political tides of the Vatican, at times ensuring that the right pope remained in power, and at other times directly affecting the outcomes of papal elections. In medieval warfare, the soldiers and mercenaries held far more power than anyone realized. While kings may have been the public face of war, it was the military leaders, the ones who commanded armies, forged alliances with mercenaries, and understood the shifting tides of battle, who truly determined the outcomes of wars. In times of rebellion, it was the soldiers who sided with the rebels who could overthrow kings. In times of peace, it was the mercenaries who, though often disbanded, remained ever present as a constant reminder that the kingdom's survival was tied to their loyalty, or their potential to shift allegiances. But this brutal reality also begs the question: how much of medieval politics was really decided by the kings and queens who wept and celebrated in their castles, and how much was determined by the men who fought for them, with no ties to anything but the weight of their swords and the lure of a hefty reward? The real power behind the throne was often in the hands of those who commanded the armies, not the monarchs, but the ones who could either win or lose it all with a single decision. As we begin to understand the influence of military power in the medieval world, we'll see that this wasn't the only force at play. Beyond the battlefield, there were secret societies, hidden guilds, and covert organizations that operated as the real power brokers of the time. These groups were the unseen architects of medieval control, and their influence stretched far beyond the reach of kings and soldiers alike. Their role in shaping the world behind closed doors is where we turn next. In the world of medieval Europe, kings, queens, and knights are the names we recognize, but there existed a far more subtle force at work, an invisible hand that quietly controlled the wealth of nations, shaped laws, and influenced the political and social landscape of the time. These were the guilds, powerful, often secretive organizations that wielded immense power from the shadows. While most people viewed them simply as trade organizations, their influence reached far beyond mere commerce. In truth, guilds were the silent rulers of the medieval economy, shaping not just trade, but the very fabric of society itself. The guilds of Venice, for example, were far more than groups of merchants working together to protect their interests. The Venetian merchant guilds controlled access to trade routes across the Mediterranean and beyond, forming the backbone of one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires in Europe. These guilds, with their intricate networks of influence, operated in such a way that they often held more sway over Venice's political decisions than the Doge himself. The wealth these guilds accumulated wasn't just through trade. They understood the power of information, of controlling what goods reached the marketplace, and when. By controlling the flow of wealth, they controlled the city itself. The Doge's political authority, though significant, often paled in comparison to the influence of these shadowy figures behind closed doors. But Venetian guilds were just one example. Across Europe, similar organizations held sway over entire nations, including the merchant guilds in cities like Florence and London, which were equally adept at manipulating the political and economic systems. They controlled everything from labor and production to the very laws that governed who could sell what and at what price. By restricting access to certain trades, they ensured that only those within the guilds could gain the wealth and power that came with them. And in doing so, they became the real decision makers, shaping the future of cities, regions, and even countries without the general populace ever being aware of their actions. Then there were the medieval Freemasons, mysterious esoteric groups that wielded considerable influence over both politics and architecture. Though the Freemasons are often associated with later periods, Their roots in the medieval world are far deeper than most realize. These early Freemasons were the builders of Europe's grand cathedrals and castles, and their influence stretched far beyond construction. They operated under a strict code of secrecy, and their guilds often provided a network that connected rulers with influential tradesmen and intellectuals. What was most striking about the Freemasons, however, was their ability to manipulate the social and political systems from within. They held an exclusive understanding of craftsmanship, knowledge, and architectural design that allowed them to shape the physical and ideological landscapes of their societies. Their influence reached into the halls of power, but they operated under a veil of secrecy that kept them largely invisible to the common people. At the heart of these guilds lay an undeniable truth. The true rulers of the medieval economy weren't the kings or queens who sat on thrones. They were the shadowy figures who controlled the markets, the trades, and the flow of wealth. In a world where power was measured not just by military might but by economic control, the guilds were the true puppeteers. They knew that money didn't just talk, it commanded armies, influenced laws, and changed the course of history. Yet, much of their influence remained hidden, obscured by the grandeur of kings and emperors who took center stage. The general populace, busy with their daily lives, rarely saw the real forces that shaped their existence. They never saw the guilds that dictated what goods could be traded, who could participate in the economy, and who would remain in the shadows. But while these guilds may have stayed out of the spotlight, their grip on the medieval world was undeniable. As we look deeper into the history of these organizations, it becomes clear that their influence was not limited to mere commerce. These guilds were also early examples of what would become even more powerful: secretive organizations, groups whose ambitions extended far beyond trade, whose reach went well into politics, religion, and the very heart of European power itself. These covert societies, operating from the shadows of history, would go on to shape the destinies of nations in ways that few could have anticipated. Their true power was masked by the seeming simplicity of their trade. But soon we will discover how they operated as the architects of destiny, pushing the world toward a future that no one expected. From these guilds, we will pivot to look at even more secretive and ambitious organizations, those whose influence was not just economic, but also ideological and political, working as hidden forces of control in ways that still echo through history today. Beneath the surface of medieval Europe, hidden in the shadows of history, there thrived secret societies, organizations whose influence stretched far beyond what most people could comprehend. These societies operated outside the bounds of public knowledge, their actions unseen, their motivations unclear. They were not simply groups bound by ideology or shared interests. They were power brokers, shaping the destinies of nations, controlling wealth, manipulating rulers, and guiding history from the shadows. Among the most infamous of these secret societies were the Knights Templar, a medieval order of knights who were thought to be the guardians of sacred knowledge and wealth. To the untrained eye, they were simply crusaders, soldiers bound to protect Christian pilgrims and the Holy Land. But beneath their outwardly pious facade, the Templars were believed to possess hidden treasures, sacred relics, and perhaps even ancient knowledge, things that could have changed the course of history. Their immense wealth and influence made them a force to be reckoned with, but their secrecy also made them a target. Rumors about their true activities swirled throughout Europe, culminating in the infamous arrests of many Templar knights in 1307, orchestrated by King Philip IV of France. But was it truly just the treasure he sought, or was there something more? Some believe the Templars' influence was far deeper than anyone realized, stretching into the halls of power, manipulating kings and emperors in ways that were never fully understood. Then there were the Rosicrucians, a mystical society whose origins remain shrouded in mystery. Their rise in the early 17th century marked the beginning of a new era in occultism, one that blended science, spirituality, and secrecy into a potent mixture that would influence not only religious thought, but also the emerging world of modern science. The Rosicrucians were more than just a secret society. They were an intellectual force, wielding power by shaping the minds of kings, philosophers, and scientists. Their cryptic symbols and teachings were designed not just to enlighten, but to control, shaping how rulers thought, acted, and made decisions. It was said that those who held the keys to Rosicrucian knowledge held the power to change the course of empires, manipulating events from the shadows through the unseen force of their intellectual and spiritual dominance. And then there were the more obscure occult organizations, groups that are largely forgotten by history, but whose influence was just as significant. These societies operated in the shadows, their members often moving through the corridors of power, unnoticed. They were the architects of revolutions, the ones who whispered in the ears of kings and popes, shaping decisions that would have far-reaching consequences. These occult societies, though less well known, were just as powerful in manipulating the social, political, and religious orders of medieval Europe. With their secret rituals, their hidden knowledge, and their cryptic codes, they were able to influence events from behind the scenes, directing the course of history with a subtlety that ensured their influence would remain concealed for centuries. What was it that made these secret societies so powerful? It wasn't just the wealth they accumulated or the knowledge they possessed. It was the secrecy itself. Operating outside the law, outside the boundaries of official power, they were free from the constraints that bound kings and nobles. They could work in ways that were impossible for public figures to do, influencing decisions, shaping alliances, and controlling information. They understood that true power didn't lie in the throne. It lay in the ability to pull strings from the shadows, to manipulate the course of history without ever being seen. But what was their end goal? Were they driven by a desire for control, for power over kingdoms and empires? Or was there something deeper at play, an ideological or spiritual agenda that pushed these societies to act in the way they did? The truth remains hidden, buried beneath layers of secrecy and centuries of disinformation. Yet what we can be certain of is this: the impact of these secret societies on the medieval world was far greater than we've been led to believe. As we uncover the true extent of their influence, we begin to see the outlines of a hidden world, a world where power was not earned through birthright or military might, but through knowledge, secrecy, and manipulation. The hidden societies of medieval Europe shaped the world we know today, yet their actions, their true motives, and their members remain largely veiled in mystery. And so, the question remains, how much of what we know about history is shaped by these unseen forces? What if the true rulers of history were not those who sat on thrones or wielded swords, but those who operated in secret, whose names never appeared in the annals of history? To answer this, we must look beyond the kings and rulers and turn our attention to another group whose power was often overlooked: the women who played a crucial role in shaping the political landscape of medieval Europe. It is to them that we now turn. Throughout history, the faces of kings and conquerors have graced the pages of textbooks and filled the halls of museums. Yet, beneath the polished surface of these familiar stories, another narrative often goes untold, one where women held power, made critical decisions, and shaped the course of empires. Though many of these women have been dismissed by traditional history, their influence was undeniable. They ruled kingdoms, advised monarchs, and sometimes even held sway over empires, all while operating in a world that largely relegated them to secondary roles. It is time to ask, could history have erased the true power of female rulers? Take, for instance, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable and influential women of the Middle Ages. Born into one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in Europe, Eleanor's life reads like an adventure novel. She was the queen of both France and England, an accomplishment few could rival. Eleanor's political acumen and fierce independence are often overshadowed by her marriages to the kings of France and England, but her real power lay in her ability to maneuver through the complex web of medieval politics. Her marriage to King Louis VII of France was one of political alliance, but it was her subsequent marriage to Henry II of England that truly showcased her influence. As the Queen of England, Eleanor ruled over vast lands, exerting considerable control over both the English and French courts. What many don't realize, however, is that Eleanor wasn't just a queen consort. She was an active participant in shaping the political and military strategies of the time. She played a pivotal role in the rebellion against her own husband, Henry II, during the 1170s. When she allied with her sons to challenge his authority, Eleanor wasn't content to sit idly by. She was a woman of ambition, intelligence, and, above all, power. Even while imprisoned for years by Henry, Eleanor continued to influence events from behind the scenes, ensuring the survival and eventual rise of her sons to the throne. But Eleanor's story is far from unique. Throughout the Middle Ages, women who were often written off by history as mere figures beside their husbands or fathers were, in fact, ruling in ways that were far more influential than their male counterparts realized. One such figure was Queen Matilda of England. Though often overshadowed by the more famous Henry II, Matilda was a queen in her own right, the daughter of King Henry I. She was also the first woman to claim the English throne, though she was denied the crown by political opposition. Instead of stepping aside, Matilda fought a bloody civil war, the Anarchy, for her rightful claim to the throne, challenging not only the political establishment but the very idea of female sovereignty in a male-dominated world. Although she never officially ruled as queen, her tenacity and political maneuvering shaped English history for generations to come. Another woman whose influence cannot be overlooked is Isabella of Castile, the Queen of Spain who, alongside her husband Ferdinand, oversaw the unification of Spain and the final expulsion of the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. Isabella's power and intelligence were essential in securing Spain's position as a dominant European power. While Ferdinand is often remembered for his military victories, it was Isabella who was the true architect of Spain's expansion, securing alliances, shaping policies, and financing voyages that changed the world forever, most notably funding Christopher Columbus' historic journey to the New World. But these women, Eleanor, Matilda, Isabella, are just a few examples. The medieval world was filled with women who wielded enormous influence, from noble women who controlled vast estates to queens and regents who held the reins of entire kingdoms. They were often behind the scenes, operating in ways that were either invisible to the public or minimized by chroniclers who preferred the stories of kings and knights. Their power, however, was just as real as that of any monarch, and their influence on the course of history is undeniable. Why, then, has history chosen to silence these women? Was it a matter of gender, a deliberate attempt to erase their power in favor of men who wore the crown, or were these women simply too formidable for their contributions to be acknowledged? Perhaps it was easier to write them out of the narrative, to reduce their roles to mere footnotes in the stories of male rulers. Whatever the reason, the truth is that these women, strong, ambitious, and influential, controlled kingdoms and empires from behind the throne, making decisions that shaped the future of nations. As we uncover the stories of these forgotten queens and leaders, we are reminded of the untold power that has always existed beyond the throne. These women were not mere consorts, they were active participants in shaping the world as we know it. And as we turn the page on their forgotten histories, we begin to see how they were part of a much larger story, one that includes the covert manipulations of powerful families, those who wielded power across generations, shaping history, not with the sword, but with alliances, marriage, and influence. But that's a story for another time, as we now shift focus to the families whose legacies, though not often told, continue to influence the world today. When we think of royalty, we often imagine the kings and queens whose names are etched in history books. Their reigns are remembered, their crowns revered. But what if these monarchs were not the true architects of their empires? What if the real power, the force that shaped the political and cultural legacy of entire nations, lay not on the thrones they sat upon, but in the bloodlines that ran through their families? What if the most famous royal families weren't just rich? They secretly ruled Europe for centuries. One such family was the Medici, whose name is synonymous with power, wealth, and influence in Renaissance Italy. While the Medici did produce powerful monarchs, such as Lorenzo de' Medici, their true legacy lay in their ability to weave a web of influence that extended far beyond the city of Florence. Through strategic marriages, alliances, and economic control, the Medici family became the de facto rulers of Italy. While their most famous member, Lorenzo, is remembered as the Magnificent, it was his family's control over banking, the arts, and politics that ensured their dominance. The Medici Bank, one of the most influential financial institutions of the time, provided the family with vast wealth that they used not just to accumulate power, but to shape the cultural and political landscape of Europe. The family's wealth allowed them to fund artists such as Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo, artists who would go on to define the Renaissance and change the course of art history forever. But the Medici influence didn't stop at the arts. The family's political savvy extended into Europe's power centres, where they forged crucial alliances with the papacy and other royal houses. It was through these marriages, often between powerful families across Italy and beyond, that the Medici secured their control over Florence, eventually becoming the rulers of the city-state for generations. Beyond Italy, the Medici played a significant role in shaping European politics. They married into the French royal family, with Catherine de' Medici becoming Queen of France, influencing not only French politics, but the entire balance of European power during the 16th century. Through such marriages, the Medici family extended their reach, subtly controlling the political landscape of Europe without ever needing to hold the throne themselves. They wielded their influence behind the scenes, shaping events through their control of wealth, religion, and strategic unions. The Medici didn't need crowns to rule. They did it with marriage contracts, financial leverage, and calculated moves in the game of dynastic politics. The power of royal families, however, was not unique to the Medici. Across Europe, families like the Bourbons, Habsburgs, and Tudors used similar tactics to ensure their influence lasted beyond their direct reigns. The Habsburgs, for example, ruled a vast empire through a complex web of intermarriages. Their strategic unions across Europe ensured that they held political sway over much of the continent, even as their direct rule diminished. By marrying into the royal families of Spain, France, and Hungary, the Habsburgs ensured that their bloodline would continue to influence Europe's political decisions, even when their names no longer graced the thrones. Similarly, the Tudors, while famous for Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, were also skilled players in the game of dynastic politics. While Henry VIII is remembered for his dramatic break with the Catholic Church, it was his daughter, Elizabeth, whose reign marked the peak of Tudor power. However, Elizabeth, like many before her, didn't operate in a vacuum. She inherited a complex network of alliances and bloodlines, all orchestrated by her predecessors. These alliances helped ensure the stability of her rule and shaped the trajectory of England, making the Tudor family far more influential than the monarchs themselves could ever be. As we look closer at the power dynamics within these royal families, it becomes clear that their influence wasn't always rooted in their ability to rule openly. Instead, it was their strategic manipulation of marriage, wealth, and alliances that allowed them to control the future of nations. Their children, often married off to other powerful families, carried their influence into future generations, ensuring their names and legacies remained at the heart of European power structures. But behind the wealth and the alliances lay another world, one of intrigue and secrecy. These families didn't only rely on diplomacy and marriage. Their influence was bolstered by another, more covert force, spies and informants, who whispered in the corridors of power, feeding the families with information that helped them manipulate events to their advantage. In the next section, we'll explore this shadowy world of espionage, where information itself became one of the most powerful tools in shaping the course of history. What if the most critical battles in history weren't won by soldiers on the front lines, but by spies operating in the shadows? Imagine the world of medieval warfare, where the clash of armies often dominated the headlines, but the true tides of conflict were shifted by unseen figures, spies who infiltrated the courts, the battlefield, and the very hearts of nations. These covert agents, working in the dark corners of Europe, held the key to victory or defeat, manipulating the course of history without ever stepping onto the battlefield. The medieval world was rife with conflict, wars between kingdoms, rival noble families, and even the church, each vying for power and influence. In these turbulent times, espionage became an essential tool in the hands of monarchs, popes, and noble families. Kings and rulers, often unable to trust those closest to them, relied heavily on spies to gather intelligence, sabotage enemies, and sometimes even orchestrate assassinations. The true art of warfare in the medieval period wasn't just about soldiers on horseback. It was about who could control the flow of information, who could learn the enemy's secrets, and who could manipulate those secrets to their advantage. Take, for example, the role of espionage during the 100 Years' War between England and France. While we remember figures like Joan of Arc and Henry V for their valour in battle, it was the spies who quietly shifted the balance of power. In England, one of the most notable figures in espionage was Sir William Cecil, an intelligence officer who served under Queen Elizabeth. Though he is often remembered for his work as a statesman, Cecil's early career as a spy during the reign of Queen Mary saw him navigating the complex web of alliances between France, Spain, and the English throne. Cecil, with his network of informants and spies, was instrumental in ensuring that England stayed one step ahead of its enemies. But espionage wasn't reserved for high-ranking nobles or royalty alone. Mercenaries, those hired soldiers who fought for pay rather than loyalty, often doubled as spies. Operating outside the law, these shadowy figures moved freely between borders, gathering intelligence for the highest bidder. The mercenaries of the 100 Years' War, in particular, were notorious for their ability to extract vital information from enemy ranks, sometimes through bribes, other times through more nefarious means. These mercenary spies, often seen as nothing more than soldiers for hire, became indispensable tools in shaping political and military strategies. They would cross into enemy territory under the guise of soldiers, but their true purpose was far darker: to gather information, to report back on troop movements, and even to sabotage supplies and fortifications. The distinction between soldier and spy often blurred in medieval warfare, where betrayal and espionage were as deadly as any sword. But what made espionage truly powerful in the medieval period was not just the act of gathering information, it was the control of that information. Spies, operating outside the established structures of law and order, could manipulate outcomes without ever being detected. In the shadowy world of medieval espionage, the spy's ability to move undetected, to infiltrate the enemy's ranks, and to plant misinformation could determine the course of battles, the fate of kings, and the stability of entire nations. Information, in this context, was as valuable as any weapon. An agent who could decode a secret message, slip past enemy lines, or leak false intelligence could change the direction of a war without ever drawing a sword. Espionage in the medieval world wasn't just about gathering intelligence. It was about destabilizing power, shifting allegiances, and creating openings where armies could strike with devastating force. A successful spy could destroy a kingdom's military capacity without ever needing to engage in open conflict. This was the power of the unseen war. The war fought in shadows and whispers, where the pen, or more accurately, the covert letter, was mightier than the sword. As we peel back the layers of medieval espionage, it becomes clear how deeply embedded this shadowy world was in the politics and power dynamics of the time. While we often glorify the knights, the kings, and the battlefield heroes, the true masters of medieval conflict were the spies, those whose names never appeared in the history books, but whose actions turned the tide of history in ways we may never fully understand. Now that we've seen how spies shaped the course of wars and politics in the medieval period, the story doesn't end with their covert operations. The true power of espionage lies not just in the gathering of information, but in the manipulation of that information itself. The Church, with its control over knowledge, became a key player in shaping the way information was disseminated and concealed. In the next section, we will explore how the Church played a crucial role in the control of knowledge and the strategic manipulation of what the public was allowed to know, shaping the destinies of entire civilizations. Did the Church hide the truths of history from the public? What secrets were erased in the name of control? These are questions that echo through the centuries, touching on one of the most powerful and enigmatic institutions of the medieval world, the Church. For over 1,000 years, the Catholic Church held an unrivaled monopoly on knowledge and information, wielding its immense power not only through religious authority, but also through the control of what people were allowed to know, learn, and believe. From controlling texts to suppressing knowledge, the Church crafted a version of history that suited its agenda, shaping the minds of entire generations. At the heart of the Church's power was its control over education and literacy. In a time when the majority of the population was illiterate, the Church stood as the sole institution capable of reading and interpreting sacred texts. The monasteries, which were the centers of learning, held vast libraries filled with knowledge that was carefully curated, and often restricted, to maintain the Church's dominance. To challenge the teachings of the Church was to challenge the very foundation of society itself. As the only authorized interpreters of divine and earthly truths, the Church shaped not only religious thought, but also the political landscape of medieval Europe. One of the most significant figures in solidifying this control was Pope Gregory VII. In the 11th century, Gregory sought to consolidate the power of the papacy, ensuring that the Church not only controlled the spiritual lives of people, but also the political systems of Europe. His papal reforms were a direct challenge to the kings and rulers of Europe, asserting that the Church was the true authority over the state. Gregory's efforts, including the infamous investiture controversy, were designed to ensure that the Church, not monarchs, could control the appointment of bishops and other key figures, allowing the papacy to dominate Europe's power structures. Through these moves, Gregory laid the foundations for papal supremacy, pushing the idea that the Pope was God's chosen representative on earth, above even the kings who ruled the lands. Yet, it wasn't just political power the Church sought to control. It also sought to control knowledge itself. During the medieval period, the Church's grip on intellectual thought was absolute, and any ideas that contradicted its teachings were quickly suppressed. Perhaps the most infamous examples of this suppression were the burning of heretics and the censorship of scientific ideas that threatened the Church's dogma. The Inquisition, a powerful arm of the Church, became notorious for its brutal tactics in eradicating heresy. Those who dared question the Church's authority were labelled heretics, often subjected to torture and execution. Books were banned, thinkers silenced, and knowledge was hidden away, all in the name of preserving the power of the Church. Scientific ideas, too, were often suppressed if they contradicted religious doctrine. Perhaps the most famous instance of this is the case of Galileo Galilei, whose support of the heliocentric model of the universe, arguably the most groundbreaking scientific theory of the time, led to his condemnation by the Church. Galileo's work directly challenged the geocentric model upheld by the Church, which placed Earth at the center of the universe. In 1633, the Church placed his writings on the Index of Forbidden Books, and Galileo was forced to recant his findings under threat of torture. His case was just one of many instances where the Church worked tirelessly to maintain control over scientific discovery, ensuring that any knowledge that could potentially weaken its grip on the truth was erased from public consciousness. The Church also employed religious dogma as a tool of control, using the concept of divine truth to silence opposition. By positioning itself as the ultimate arbiter of truth, the Church effectively placed itself above reason, science, and personal interpretation. Those who questioned the Church's teachings were not only defying authority, but also committing a sin against God. This ideological control extended to politics, as kings and rulers who sought to challenge the Church's authority were often met with excommunication or other forms of punishment that stripped them of their power and legitimacy. The Church's manipulation of history is a powerful example of how knowledge and information can be used as a tool of control. By shaping the narrative of the past and controlling the flow of information, the Church maintained its dominance over medieval society for centuries. The suppression of knowledge was not just about protecting religious doctrine, it was about maintaining a power structure that benefited the Church, keeping the masses in a state of ignorance and submission. As we examine this control of knowledge, we begin to see the extent to which the Church influenced the course of history. But while the Church held sway over much of Europe's intellectual landscape, there were those who sought to challenge its authority. In the next section, we'll uncover the hidden figures who dared to question the Church, rewriting history in ways that would challenge its grip on power and knowledge. These rebels, philosophers, and reformers played a crucial role in shaping the future, even as they were silenced by the very institution they sought to defy. Could these heretics have been the true prophets of history? What if they were silenced not for their ideas, but because they were too close to the truth? Throughout history, there have been individuals who, daring to challenge the established order, risked everything to question the very foundations of power, religion, and truth. These were the rebels, men and women whose voices were often drowned out by the weight of the institutions they defied, yet whose ideas, though suppressed, would go on to spark revolutions, reshape societies, and alter the course of history. One of the earliest and most courageous of these rebels was John Wycliffe, an English theologian and priest who dared to question the authority of the Catholic Church. In the 14th century, Wycliffe became one of the first to criticize the Church's teachings, particularly its practice of selling indulgences, a form of financial exploitation that promised the remission of sins. But it was just the corrupt practices of the Church that troubled him. Wycliffe challenged its very doctrines. He argued that the Bible should be accessible to all people, not just to the clergy who controlled its interpretation. This revolutionary idea led him to translate the Bible into English, giving ordinary people the ability to read and interpret the holy text for themselves. His translation would prove to be a dangerous act, one that would threaten the Church's monopoly on knowledge and spiritual authority. Wycliffe's views were radical, and he was eventually condemned as a heretic. His writings were banned, and after his death, his bones were exhumed and burned as part of an effort to erase his influence. But Wycliffe's ideas, far from fading into obscurity, would inspire future reformers, including the likes of Martin Luther and John Calvin, who would carry the torch of religious reform across Europe. In Bohemia, another radical voice was rising. Jan Hus, a priest and theologian, was profoundly influenced by Wycliffe's teachings. Like Wycliffe, Hus criticized the Church's corruption, but his ideas were even more dangerous to the establishment. He called for reforms in the Church, particularly in its practices surrounding indulgences, its wealth, and its control over the lives of the people. Hus's fiery sermons and writings spread like wildfire, challenging the authority of the Pope and demanding that the Church return to its humble, spiritual roots. His ideas quickly found an audience, particularly among the common people, and soon became a rallying cry for those who felt oppressed by the Church's stranglehold on society. But like Wycliffe before him, Hus was condemned as a heretic. In 1415, at the Council of Constance, he was summoned to defend his views. Despite being promised safe conduct, he was arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake. Hus's death was a powerful statement by the Church, a reminder of the price one would pay for defying its authority. Yet, despite his gruesome end, his ideas lived on. His followers, known as the Hussites, continued to spread his teachings, and the echoes of his rebellion would later resonate in the Protestant Reformation. What was it that made these rebels so dangerous? It wasn't just their challenge to the Church's wealth or political power. It was their very questioning of the accepted narrative of history. Wycliffe and Hus, along with many others, were not just questioning the Church's authority. They were questioning the history that had been written by the powerful institutions of their time. They believed that the truth had been obscured, that knowledge had been deliberately hidden from the masses, and that the true message of faith had been buried beneath layers of dogma and corruption. By challenging the Church's teachings, they were also challenging the entire structure of medieval society, the hierarchies of power that were built upon unquestioned authority. As these rebels' ideas spread, so did the consequences. While many were marginalized, silenced, or erased from mainstream historical accounts, their ideas were not easily extinguished. Their radical notions, though demonized by the powers that be, became the seeds of future movements. The Protestant Reformation, which would erupt a century later, was in many ways the culmination of Wycliffe's and Hus's challenges to the status quo. The very idea that the individual could interpret the Bible for themselves, that religious authority could be challenged, would shake the foundations of Christianity, and by extension, the political and social structures that were so deeply intertwined with the Church. The legacy of these rebels lives on in the countless reform movements, revolutions, and intellectual revolutions that followed. The power of their ideas, though often suppressed or demonized, was undeniable. They had dared to ask the questions that others feared to ask, to explore the truths that had been buried by centuries of religious and political manipulation. In doing so, they set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of history. Yet, as we uncover the stories of these forgotten rebels, it becomes clear that their fight was not just against the Church, but against a larger system of control that spanned across the medieval world. They were up against the very fabric of society, where the flow of knowledge was tightly controlled, where ideas that threatened the established order were suppressed, and where the voices of those who dared to challenge the truth were silenced. But in their defiance, they laid the groundwork for a new world, one in which the truth could no longer be hidden by those in power. Having explored these rebels and their fight to rewrite history, we now shift focus to a different, yet equally powerful force, those who shape the world from behind the scenes, not with the sword or the pen, but through trade and commerce. These merchants and their networks of influence will show us another side of medieval power, one that was just as secretive, just as influential but far more covert. The trade routes, the alliances formed through commerce, and the subtle influence these figures wielded will reveal yet another hidden force in the shaping of medieval politics and culture. What if the true kings of the medieval world weren't warriors, but wealthy traders who controlled the very fabric of the economy? In the heart of medieval Europe, it wasn't always the monarchs who held the reins of power. While kings and emperors focused on expanding their territories through military conquest, there was another group, one whose wealth and influence reached far beyond the battlefield. These were the merchants, the men and women who built empires, not with swords, but with trade, capital, and alliances. The merchant guilds, those powerful organizations that controlled the flow of goods and services across Europe, wielded influence that rivaled and sometimes surpassed that of kings and queens. The rise of merchant guilds during the medieval period marked a turning point in European history. These guilds, initially formed to protect the interests of traders and craftsmen, soon became the economic backbone of cities, regions, and entire nations. Venice and Genoa, for example, were not just wealthy states, they were centers of global commerce, their influence extending across the Mediterranean and into the furthest reaches of Europe and Asia. The Venetian and Genoese merchant guilds were not merely commercial entities, they were political players in their own right, often influencing or directly controlling the decisions of the monarchs who ruled the territories they operated in. The wealth that flowed through these cities, generated by trade in everything from spices and silk to grain and wool, gave merchants unparalleled power, enabling them to form alliances, control trade routes, and, at times, dictate terms to kings and emperors. The Hanseatic League, a federation of merchant guilds across northern Europe, was another example of how trade could shape political realities. Comprised of cities like Liedbeck, Hamburg, and Bremen, the League controlled a vast network of trade routes stretching from the North Sea to the Baltic and beyond. The merchants of the Hanseatic League, united by their economic interests, were so powerful that they could negotiate with kings, intimidate entire nations, and exert control over vast swaths of Europe's commerce. They were the unseen force behind the rise of some of Europe's most prosperous cities, shaping economies and forging political alliances without the need for a single sword to be drawn. In many ways, merchant guilds became the true power brokers of medieval society. Their control over trade routes and their wealth allowed them to shape the political landscape in ways that many monarchs could only dream of. While kings were concerned with land and armies, the merchants controlled the lifeblood of the economy, currency, goods, and information. In Venice, for example, the merchants weren't just traders, they were part of the ruling class, with enormous influence over the political system. The doges, the elected leaders of Venice, were often chosen from the ranks of the merchant elite, their power firmly tied to the economic success of the city-state. The wealth of Venice was so great that it could afford to wage wars, build fleets, and pay for lavish public works, all without ever relying on a king to fund them. But the power of merchant guilds was not without its tensions. As these guilds grew in wealth and influence, they sometimes found themselves at odds with the monarchs and the church. The merchant elite's focus on profit often clashed with the religious and moral values of the time. In some cases, the church condemned the merchants for their usury, their practice of lending money for interest, which was considered sinful by medieval standards. Despite this, the wealth of these guilds allowed them to wield influence over the very institutions that sought to curtail their power. The merchants made kings indebted to them, loaning them money for wars, infrastructure projects, and even their daily expenses. In return, the merchants gained favor, political influence, and even the right to dictate the terms of trade. This economic dominance didn't just shape the course of commerce, it also had profound effects on the social fabric of medieval society. As cities grew wealthier, the merchant class became increasingly powerful, eventually challenging the traditional feudal order, where once the nobility held all the land. The rise of the merchant class created a new aristocracy, one based on wealth rather than birthright. This shift in power would eventually lay the groundwork for the rise of capitalism and the modern economic system. The true power of merchant guilds, however, lay not just in their ability to control trade or shape political decisions, but in their ability to manipulate the flow of information. Merchants knew that information was as valuable as any commodity. The success of their enterprises depended not just on what they traded, but on knowing where to trade, when to trade, and how to control the supply and demand. They used this knowledge to build empires of influence, using their wealth to sway public opinion, control markets, and sometimes even influence the policies of monarchs who were in their debt. As we explore the rise of merchant guilds and their influence on medieval Europe, it becomes clear that their power was built not just on commerce, but on the ability to shape the world around them. The monarchs may have ruled from their thrones, but it was the merchants who ruled from the shadows, controlling the economy, manipulating the political landscape, and ensuring that their wealth and influence would continue to grow. From these guilds, we now shift our focus to a more overtly violent, yet equally impactful force, the Crusades. These religious wars, often seen as battles for faith, were also driven by political and economic motivations. In the next section, we will examine how these religious conflicts became a tool for expanding economic networks, and how the merchants of Europe capitalized on the Crusades to further their reach across the continent. Were the Crusades really about religion? Or were they a brilliant strategy to reshape the medieval world's economy and power structures? The answer to this question lies not just in the religious fervor that fueled the campaigns, but in the deeper, hidden motivations that spurred Europe's kings, nobles, and merchants to take up arms and march across the seas. While history often paints the Crusades as holy wars aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land from Muslim control, the truth is far more complex. Beneath the surface of these religious campaigns lay a network of economic interests, territorial ambitions, and the pursuit of wealth that often overshadowed the stated religious goals. At the heart of the Crusades was Pope Urban II, who, in 1095, called for the First Crusade to recapture Jerusalem. The Pope framed the campaign as a religious duty, calling upon Christians to fight for the sacred city and secure their place in heaven. But behind Urban's passionate speeches lay the very real interests of the Church and European rulers. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had been in decline, and Urban saw the Crusades as an opportunity to not only reunite the Christian world, but also to expand the power of the papacy. By leading a massive campaign into the Holy Land, the Pope could cement his authority over the Christian world, and with the support of kings and nobles, exert influence over vast territories. The idea of holy war provided a convenient excuse to pursue territorial expansion, allowing European powers to take control of land, trade routes, and resources in the East. But it wasn't just the Pope who stood to gain. For the European kings and nobles, the Crusades were a chance to increase their power, wealth, and influence. The Holy Land was rich in valuable resources, from spices to precious metals, and its strategic location was a gateway to the lucrative trade routes connecting Europe to Asia and Africa. For centuries, Venice, Genoa, and other merchant cities had dreamed of securing access to these trade routes. The Crusades offered them an unprecedented opportunity. Merchants, who had already established strong ties with the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim world, saw the campaign as a way to expand their influence and secure profitable trading privileges in the East. These wealthy traders were not just motivated by religious zeal, they were driven by the potential for vast economic gain. They provided financing, ships, and resources to fuel the Crusades, and in return, they expected to benefit from expanded trade and new markets. The Venetian Republic, in particular, played a crucial role in the success of the First Crusade. As the leading naval power in Europe, Venice used its fleet to transport crusaders to the Holy Land. However, this was no act of pure charity. The Venetians had their own agenda. They sought to control trade routes and gain commercial privileges in the Eastern Mediterranean. The famous sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204 is a perfect example of how the Crusades blurred the lines between religious fervor and economic conquest. Rather than heading directly to Jerusalem, the Crusaders, led by Venetian merchants, diverted their campaign to Constantinople, a wealthy and strategically located city. The sack of Constantinople allowed Venice to seize control of crucial trade routes, effectively boosting its economic and political dominance in the region. The Crusades also opened the door for European powers to exert influence over the Mediterranean and beyond. As Crusader states were established in the Levant, a network of Latin kingdoms controlled key cities, like Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem. These territories became economic hubs, with merchants from across Europe establishing trade outposts and profiting from the exchange of goods such as silk, spices, and precious stones. In fact, the Crusades helped lay the groundwork for the expansion of Europe's trading networks, and many of the routes opened during the campaigns would remain vital to European economies for centuries. The commercial links between Europe and the East that were established during this period would eventually fuel the age of exploration, as merchants and explorers sought new ways to expand their access to wealth. But what of the religious motives that have been so often associated with the Crusades? Were they simply a smokescreen for the pursuit of wealth and power? While it is undeniable that many crusaders believed they were embarking on a holy mission, it is equally clear that the political and economic benefits of the campaigns were just as important, if not more so, to those who financed and led them. The blending of religious fervor with economic ambition is perhaps best illustrated by the way the Church, despite its role in promoting the Crusades, was also deeply invested in the financial rewards of the campaigns. The Church benefited from the redistribution of land and wealth, as crusaders often donated their estates to the Church in exchange for indulgences or protection for their souls. In a sense, the Crusades acted as both a spiritual mission and a means for the Church and European elites to expand their influence and wealth. The question, then, is whether the Crusades were truly religious wars or carefully orchestrated power plays. While they certainly had religious overtones, it is clear that they were as much about trade, politics, and territorial expansion as they were about faith. For the kings, merchants, and the Church, the Crusades were an opportunity to reshape the medieval world's economy and power structures in ways that would have lasting effects on European and global history. As the Crusades opened new economic opportunities, they also contributed to the rise of cities, which became the centers of power and commerce. These growing urban centers, often controlled by powerful merchant families, would begin to rival the political influence of the medieval kingdoms themselves. In the next section, we will explore how these cities came to dominate the medieval world, creating networks of influence that stretched far beyond their borders, and how they laid the foundations for the modern economic and political systems that followed. What if the greatest powers of the medieval world weren't kingdoms or empires, but thriving cities that controlled the flow of wealth, knowledge, and power? While the kings and queens of medieval Europe focused their energy on securing land, raising armies, and expanding their territorial domains, there were other forces at work in the heart of Europe and beyond, forces that operated not with swords or crowns, but with commerce, culture, and influence. The rise of powerful cities like Venice, Florence, and Baghdad marked a profound shift in the medieval world. These urban centers became hubs of wealth, culture, and political power, often surpassing the authority of monarchs and kingdoms in terms of economic and cultural dominance. Venice, for example, was not just a city, it was a powerhouse, a republic in its own right, whose influence reached far beyond its canals and marble palaces. By controlling the trade routes of the Mediterranean, Venice amassed extraordinary wealth, becoming the commercial gateway between Europe and the East. The Venetians understood that power lay not only in military conquest, but in controlling the movement of goods and ideas. Their merchant fleet dominated the seas, and their ability to broker deals and secure exclusive trade privileges gave them unparalleled political influence. Unlike traditional feudal systems, where power was tied to land, Venice, strength was rooted in its ability to control commerce and trade. The city became so powerful that despite its relatively small size, it could dictate the terms of international trade and politics, all while operating as a republic, free from the constraints of a monarchical system. Florence, too, became a center of unparalleled wealth and influence, but its power lay not just in trade, it was in finance. By the 14th century, the Medici family had transformed Florence into a banking empire, controlling not only the city's finances but also much of the wealth of Europe. The Medici's banking operations, which included lending money to monarchs and the church, allowed them to wield tremendous power over European politics. They were the silent rulers of Florence, shaping the course of the city's art, politics, and culture, while remaining firmly behind the scenes. The Medici family funded some of the most famous artists and architects in history, including Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Botticelli, reshaping not only Florence, but the entire Renaissance. Their power extended far beyond banking, as they used their wealth to control political offices, influence the papacy, and create lasting legacies in both art and governance. Florence, like Venice, was a city-state, operating outside the traditional feudal system where land and military power reigned supreme. Here, wealth and influence in the marketplace determined who would rule. In the east, the city of Baghdad was similarly influential, though in a different context. During the Islamic Golden Age, Baghdad was the intellectual and cultural heart of the Muslim world. As the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, it became a beacon of knowledge and innovation, where scholars from across the Islamic world gathered to exchange ideas, and where scientific, mathematical, and philosophical advancements flourished. But Baghdad's influence was not just intellectual, it was economic and political. Situated at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa, Baghdad controlled the flow of goods, ideas, and information. This made the city a powerful player in the medieval world, as it acted as both a cultural centre and a key node in the vast network of trade that spanned continents. The wealth of Baghdad came not just from military conquest or territorial expansion, but from its ability to dominate trade, culture, and education across the known world. What made these cities unique was their ability to operate outside the constraints of the traditional feudal system. While monarchs focused on conquering land and building armies, cities like Venice, Florence, and Baghdad wielded power through wealth and culture, using their control over trade, finance, and knowledge to influence the political landscape. These cities understood that power wasn't just about land, it was about controlling the flow of resources and information, and in doing so, they created dynasties that surpassed even the power of kings. The Medici, for example, built a dynasty not through military conquest, but through their control of banking and commerce, positioning themselves as the true power brokers of Renaissance Italy. The rise of these urban centres was also a testament to the changing nature of power in medieval Europe. While monarchies and empires were still the dominant political structures, the growing influence of cities marked the beginning of a shift toward a more complex, interconnected world. The wealth generated by these cities and their ability to control trade and culture allowed them to exert power not only over their immediate surroundings but across vast regions. These cities were the birthplaces of the modern economic and political systems that would later dominate the world. In a world where the traditional feudal order was often based on land ownership and military prowess, these cities operated in a different sphere. Their strength lay in their ability to control resources, whether it was through banking, trade, or intellectual capital. The very idea of a city-state that could rival the power of kings was revolutionary, and it laid the foundation for the development of modern cities as centres of power and influence. As we examine the rise of these cities, we begin to see how they set the stage for the shifting balance of power in Europe. But while these cities were growing in influence, there was another force at work, one that operated in the shadows of diplomacy and alliances. In the next section, we'll turn our attention to the complex web of treaties and military alliances that helped to shape the balance of power in medieval Europe, often allowing merchants, cities, and royal families to manipulate the course of history from behind the scenes. Who were the masterminds behind the political alliances that changed the course of history? The diplomats you never knew about held the keys to power. Behind every treaty, every royal marriage, and every foreign policy decision that altered the fate of nations, there were skilled diplomats. Figures working in the shadows, negotiating, convincing, and sometimes manipulating events to secure alliances that would define the destiny of entire kingdoms. While kings and queens often took the public credit for victories or peace treaties, it was these unseen negotiators who quietly wielded more influence than the monarchs they represented. One of the most pivotal figures in medieval diplomacy was François de la Rochefoucauld, a French nobleman and diplomat who served under King Louis XIII. While not widely recognized by name, de la Rochefoucauld's influence was vast, especially in the context of France's foreign policy during a period of great instability. France was embroiled in wars with both Spain and England, and the fate of the French monarchy rested not just on the battlefield, but in the delicate negotiations of treaties, alliances, and marriages. De la Rochefoucauld, with his sharp mind and understanding of power, played a crucial role in shaping the diplomatic strategy of France during the 30 Years' war. His work behind the scenes ensured that France could maneuver through complex alliances, shifting loyalties and changing power dynamics in Europe. Without men like de la Rochefoucauld, the political landscape of Europe would have looked very different. Diplomats like him were the architects of power, carefully crafting relationships between monarchs and noble families that lasted for generations. Royal marriages were often the linchpin of these alliances. When a marriage between two powerful families was arranged, it was not just a union of love, it was a calculated political maneuver that could bring peace or war, prosperity or ruin. These alliances often determined the boundaries of kingdoms, the rise and fall of empires, and the fate of millions. For example, when Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon in the late 15th century, their union didn't just consolidate Spain. It united two of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. This marriage was a political maneuver as much as it was a romantic one that secured the future of Spain as a unified kingdom and laid the groundwork for the Reconquista, the expulsion of the Moors, and the subsequent age of exploration. But diplomats didn't just orchestrate royal marriages. They were also responsible for negotiating treaties that determined the course of wars, the distribution of wealth, and the redrawing of borders. The Treaty of Versailles in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, was a monumental diplomatic achievement, negotiated by diplomats who understood the delicate balance of power in Europe. The treaty not only reshaped Europe's political landscape, but also established the framework for modern diplomacy, reinforcing the idea that peace could be achieved not just through military might but through careful negotiation and compromise. This was the world of medieval diplomacy, a world where the fate of nations rested not on battlefields, but on the tables of negotiation, where every word spoken could tip the scales in favor of one side or another. One of the most intriguing aspects of medieval diplomacy was how it operated outside the traditional feudal system. While kings and lords fought for land and military control, diplomats were often more focused on controlling information, forging alliances, and securing resources through negotiation rather than warfare. It was a world where knowledge was as powerful as an army, and where the art of persuasion could win the day. In this delicate web of political maneuvering, diplomats played a role akin to that of modern statesmen, navigating complex networks of power, loyalty, and trust to shape the destiny of their nations. As we look at the history of these diplomats, we begin to understand the incredible depth of influence they held. They didn't just advise kings, they were the ones pulling the strings, setting the stage for the wars, alliances, and peace treaties that shaped the medieval world. Their ability to sway opinion, change allegiances, and broker deals in secret was often more decisive than any battle fought on the field. They understood that the true battle for power wasn't won through armies, but through alliances, relationships built on trust, negotiation, and sometimes manipulation. Yet, for all their influence, the work of these diplomats often went unacknowledged by the broader public. The kings and queens who signed the treaties and decrees were the ones who received the glory. The diplomats, however, worked in the shadows, their achievements only coming to light when the consequences of their decisions became apparent, sometimes years or even centuries later. With this understanding of the hidden world of diplomacy, we now move to the next stage of power, the unseen world of espionage. While diplomats were shaping the alliances that defined the future of nations, spies were gathering the crucial intelligence that made those alliances possible. In the next section, we will explore how spies played a critical role in securing diplomatic victories and shaping the course of history, working silently behind the scenes to gather information, sabotage enemies, and manipulate the political landscape in ways that changed the fate of kingdoms. What if the fate of kingdoms was not decided by the clash of armies, but by whispers in the dark? Spies shaped history in ways we're only just beginning to understand. Behind every great political shift, every war, and every peace treaty, there was an unseen force at work, an invisible hand guiding the course of events. In the shadows of medieval courts, armies, and rival factions, spies operated, gathering intelligence, feeding secrets to their masters, and sometimes altering the fate of entire nations without a single sword being drawn. Espionage was not just an art of gathering information, it was a tool of manipulation, power, and survival. The medieval world was a place of constant intrigue, where alliances were forged and broken in the blink of an eye, and where the stakes were high. Monarchs, popes, and noble families knew that the key to securing power and winning wars wasn't just in the strength of their armies, it was in the information they could gather about their enemies. Spies therefore became indispensable figures in this intricate web of power. They were the silent warriors who infiltrated rival courts, armies, and diplomatic negotiations, operating with a level of secrecy and danger that made their lives both thrilling and perilous. Take, for example, the Byzantine Empire, a kingdom often described as a master of espionage. The Byzantines understood the power of intelligence better than most. Their vast network of spies extended from the royal court to distant regions, infiltrating foreign lands and gathering vital information about their enemies. The Byzantine emperor could rely on these covert agents to report back on everything from troop movements to political unrest, allowing them to make strategic decisions that often outmaneuvered rivals. Spies operated in cities like Constantinople, hidden in plain sight, posing as merchants, scholars, or even common citizens, while secretly gathering intelligence on behalf of the empire. The level of secrecy required was profound. Spies couldn't trust anyone, not even their closest allies. One slip-up could mean death. Across Europe, monarchs relied on their own networks of spies to navigate the complex and often hostile political landscape. Richard the Lionheart, for example, was one of the most famous medieval kings to use espionage effectively during the Crusades. As he waged war against Saladin for control of the Holy Land, Richard employed spies to gather crucial intelligence about Saladin's movements, strategies, and weaknesses. These secret agents risked their lives to infiltrate enemy camps, engage in espionage within enemy cities, and return with invaluable information that could alter the course of entire battles. Richard's spies were instrumental in shaping the decisions he made, from military strategy to diplomatic negotiations. They were his eyes and ears in a foreign land, feeding him the information needed to stay one step ahead of his adversaries. The Venetian Republic, with its dominance in Mediterranean trade, also understood the power of espionage. The Venetian spies were some of the most skilled and resourceful in the medieval world. They infiltrated the courts of rival states, gathering intelligence on military movements, trade secrets, and political affairs. Venice's vast network of spies was key to maintaining the city's influence over trade routes and its rivalries with other powers, including the Byzantine Empire and later the Ottoman Empire. Venice's ability to control the flow of information gave it a distinct advantage over its enemies, allowing it to strike at the right moment and expand its dominance across the seas. In this world where knowledge was the true weapon, spies were not merely informants, they were the strategic minds shaping the destiny of empires. The lives of these spies were dangerous and fraught with betrayal. Their identities had to be kept hidden, their missions kept secret, often from even the people they worked for. The job of a spy was never simple. It required cunning, deception, and a deep understanding of human nature. Spies had to master the art of reading people, understanding their motivations, and using that knowledge to gain their trust, or to manipulate them into revealing crucial information. Many spies operated undercover for years, sometimes never revealing their true allegiance to anyone, always walking a fine line between success and discovery. Their work could make or break kingdoms, but it also often left them isolated and alone, with no real recognition for their achievements. The spies of the medieval world were the unsung heroes of diplomacy and warfare. Operating far from the public eye, their actions shaping the course of history in ways that would remain largely unknown to the masses. Yet, despite the secrecy and danger surrounding their work, the spies were more than just tools of war. They were also instrumental in shaping the political landscape of the time. Spies were the first to uncover weaknesses in enemy alliances, the first to learn of internal uprisings or dissent within courts, and the first to notice when a monarch was losing favor with their people. Their intelligence allowed rulers to act preemptively, striking at the right moment, or sometimes avoiding conflict altogether. In a world where information could mean the difference between life and death, spies became invaluable, not only as soldiers but as strategists, decision-makers, and influencers in their own right. As we examine the hidden world of espionage, we begin to see how the true battles of the medieval world were often fought not with weapons, but with secrets. The fate of nations wasn't always determined by military might. It was determined by the flow of information, the intelligence gathered, and the whispers in the dark. These spies operating in the shadows played a role as critical to the survival of empires as any army or general. Having uncovered the secret lives of spies and their pivotal roles in shaping the medieval world, we now turn our attention to another hidden force, the manipulation of information itself. Propaganda and disinformation were powerful tools used to shape public opinion, control political power, and direct the course of history. In the next section, we will explore how information was weaponized to create narratives that served the interests of the powerful, manipulating entire populations in the name of politics and control. What if everything you've been told about medieval rulers was shaped by propaganda? The hidden narratives that controlled the medieval world will shock you. In a time before mass media, kings, the church, and political factions understood the immense power of shaping the stories people told themselves about the world. It wasn't just about conquering lands or winning battles. Those who controlled information had the power to control entire populations. Propaganda and disinformation were not only tools of war, they were instruments of governance, used to consolidate power, suppress dissent, and craft narratives that would endure for centuries. One of the most fascinating examples of propaganda in the medieval world comes from the reign of King Henry II of England. Henry, known for his turbulent relationship with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, understood the power of public perception. When Becket was murdered in 1170, many believed it was at the king's instigation. To counter this narrative and preserve his rule, Henry worked quickly to shape the story. He strategically manipulated the public's understanding of the event, using the church and his control over royal channels of communication to cast the situation in his favor. He was careful to distance himself from any direct involvement in Becket's death, instead framing the incident as a tragic misunderstanding, one caused by the unchecked zeal of his knights, rather than an act of royal vengeance. By controlling the narrative, Henry was able to avoid the backlash that could have jeopardized his reign, using the power of information to maintain his authority. But it wasn't just secular rulers who understood the importance of controlling public perception. The Catholic Church, with its immense power over the medieval world, was one of the earliest masters of propaganda, through the use of religious dogma and the strategic manipulation of texts. The Church shaped not only the spiritual lives of the people, but also the political landscape of Europe. In a time when most people were illiterate, the Church held a monopoly on education, and its clergy were the sole interpreters of the Bible. By controlling access to sacred texts, the Church ensured that its teachings went unchallenged and that its influence over kings, nobles, and the common people remained absolute. One of the most effective tools the Church used was the spread of religious dogma. The Church didn't just teach religious principles. It constructed entire narratives that justified its control over the people. Take, for example, the idea of divine right, the belief that kings were chosen by God to rule. This concept not only helped solidify the authority of monarchs, but also kept the lower classes in check. By promoting the idea that the king's rule was divinely ordained, the Church helped maintain the status quo, ensuring that rebellion or dissent was not only politically dangerous, but also sacrilegious. Beyond its influence over kings, the Church also wielded its power over the masses by controlling the narrative around sin, salvation, and the afterlife. The sale of indulgences, payments made to the Church in exchange for forgiveness of sins, was an example of how the Church manipulated the masses through fear and promise. By controlling the narrative surrounding salvation, the Church created a system in which people were dependent on the Church for their spiritual well-being, reinforcing its control over both the political and spiritual lives of the people. In addition to its control over religious life, the Church also employed propaganda to suppress dissent. The Inquisition, established in the 12th century, was not only a mechanism for identifying heretics, but also a means of controlling the flow of information. By branding any opposition to church doctrine as heresy, the Church stifled alternative viewpoints and suppressed intellectual movements that could challenge its authority. Through torture, executions, and the suppression of forbidden texts, the Church effectively erased inconvenient truths and rewrote history to serve its own interests. But secular rulers also used propaganda to shape the narrative of their reigns. During the 100 Years' War between England and France, both sides used propaganda to galvanize support for their respective causes. English monarchs like Edward III and Henry V used the power of the crown to shape public perception, turning what were, at times, politically motivated wars into matters of national pride and religious duty. Henry V's victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, for example, was immortalised not just as a military victory, but as a miraculous moment in which divine favour was shown to the English. The narrative surrounding the battle was carefully crafted to emphasise the role of God in the English victory, thus solidifying the legitimacy of Henry's claim to the throne and his right to lead. The use of propaganda wasn't just about military victories or political power. It was about creating a narrative that could persist beyond the events themselves. Rulers understood that the story they told about their reigns was just as important as the actions they took during their lifetimes. Through the control of information, they could shape the way future generations would view them, ensuring their legacy endured long after they were gone. As we examine how medieval leaders used propaganda to manipulate the masses, it becomes clear that the control of information was as powerful as any army. The ability to craft a narrative, to shape public opinion, and to suppress opposing views gave monarchs, the church, and political factions an immense advantage in maintaining their power. They understood that the pen, or, in their case, the sermon, the scroll, and the royal decree was mightier than the sword. As we move forward, we now turn our attention to the rise of the printing press, a revolutionary development that would drastically change the flow of information. The spread of knowledge would no longer be under the sole control of kings and the church. In the next section, we will explore how the advent of printing and the spread of literacy altered the medieval world, allowing the hidden narratives of the past to be challenged and transformed forever. Could the printing press have been the weapon that toppled an entire era? The spread of knowledge would never be the same again. Before the invention of the printing press, the flow of knowledge was tightly controlled, with books and manuscripts being hand-copied by scribes, often limited to the elites, monasteries, and the church. In the medieval world, knowledge was a privilege, one held by the few who could read and write, and even more so by those who controlled access to the written word. But in the mid-15th century, everything changed. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg would shake the very foundation of this monopoly, forever altering the course of history. Gutenberg's press, with its movable type, allowed books, pamphlets, and manuscripts to be reproduced in unprecedented numbers. What had once taken months or even years to hand copy could now be printed in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost. The printing press democratized knowledge, making it accessible to a far broader audience than ever before. For the first time, the masses could read books, explore new ideas, and engage with information outside the grasp of the church and monarchs, who had held such authority for centuries. This revolution in information spread like wildfire, challenging old power structures and forcing medieval society to confront new ideas that had previously been suppressed. One of the most profound consequences of the printing press was its role in the spread of scientific, philosophical, and religious ideas. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been the gatekeeper of knowledge. It controlled what texts were copied and distributed, often limiting access to ideas that contradicted its teachings. But with the advent of the printing press, this control was shattered. Scientific works, once only available to a small group of scholars, were now widely distributed. Philosophers like Aristotle, whose works had been preserved and translated by Islamic scholars, suddenly became accessible to scholars across Europe, sparking a renewed interest in classical thought. The printing press became the vehicle that carried the ideas of the Renaissance into the hearts and minds of ordinary people. However, it was just academic ideas that spread. The printing press became a powerful tool for political subversion, exposing the corruption and abuses of power that had been hidden by the elite. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Protestant Reformation, a movement that radically changed the religious landscape of Europe. Martin Luther, a German monk and theologian, used the printing press to disseminate his revolutionary ideas, particularly his 95 Theses, which critiqued the Catholic Church's practice of selling indulgences. Luther's ideas spread across Europe with astonishing speed, thanks in part to the printing press, which allowed his pamphlets and writings to be printed in mass quantities and distributed widely. The Church, which had once been able to suppress heretical ideas through censorship and the Inquisition, found itself powerless in the face of this new technology. Luther's pamphlets and books, often printed in the vernacular language of the people, were eagerly read by those dissatisfied with the Church's teachings. For the first time, people could read and interpret religious texts for themselves, without relying on the clergy to tell them what to believe. The printing press became a weapon in the hands of reformers, challenging the authority of the Pope and the Church, and leading to the creation of new religious movements that would splinter Christianity and alter the course of European history. But the printing press wasn't just a tool for religious revolution. It was also used by political leaders to influence public opinion and assert their authority. Kings, nobles, and monarchs quickly realized that the press could be used to spread propaganda, solidify their power, and shape the narrative of their reigns. The ability to print royal decrees, laws, and proclamations allowed rulers to bypass traditional channels of communication and speak directly to their subjects. This new form of communication gave monarchs an unprecedented ability to control the narrative surrounding their rule, effectively allowing them to frame events in their favor. The printing press also gave rise to a new kind of media, one that could be used not only for political gain, but also for social change. Pamphlets, books, and broadsheets became the vehicles through which ideas about justice, freedom, and equality were spread. The press enabled political movements, revolutions, and the exchange of ideas that would lay the foundation for the Enlightenment and the modern age. It also marked the beginning of mass communication, where information could be spread quickly and widely, reaching a far greater number of people than ever before. But the consequences of the printing press weren't always positive. With the spread of new ideas came the spread of misinformation. In the same way that the press could be used to inform, it could also be used to deceive. Propaganda, rumors, and false narratives were easily spread, and the line between truth and fiction became blurred. This new world of information, both truthful and deceitful, was a double-edged sword, one that would continue to shape history in ways that could not be predicted. The printing press marked the beginning of the end for the tightly controlled dissemination of knowledge that had characterized the medieval period. The ability to print and distribute books, pamphlets, and ideas on a massive scale allowed for the creation of an informed public that could challenge the authority of kings, the church, and traditional power structures. The power of the written word, once confined to the elite, had now been unleashed. The medieval world had given way to a new era, an era in which ideas could spread freely, and the truth could no longer be suppressed by those in power. Now that we understand how knowledge began to spread and challenge old power structures, we turn our attention to the Renaissance, which would usher in a new way of thinking about the world. The rise of cities, the rebirth of classical knowledge, and the humanist movement all played pivotal roles in changing how people viewed themselves, their societies, and their place in the world. As the Renaissance flourished, it sparked a transformation in thought that would lay the foundation for the modern world. What if the Renaissance was just the rebirth of art, but the rebirth of hidden knowledge that had been suppressed for centuries? At its core, the Renaissance was not merely a revival of classical art and culture. It was an intellectual revolution that sought to bring back the wisdom of the ancient world, rediscovering and reimagining ideas that had been buried under the weight of centuries of medieval orthodoxy. This period marked a turning point in human history, where the old ways of thinking, shaped by religious dogma and feudalism, began to be challenged by a new wave of thought, driven by curiosity, reason, and an intense desire to understand the world in ways that had long been forgotten. The Renaissance was, in many ways, a rejection of the medieval worldview, which was dominated by the church and feudal systems. For centuries, medieval thought had been shaped by religious teachings, and the prevailing belief was that knowledge came from divine revelation, not from human observation or experimentation. The church controlled much of the intellectual life of Europe, dictating what could be studied and what was considered heretical. However, as the Renaissance began to take root in the 14th and 15th centuries, scholars and artists began to look back to the classical world of Greece and Rome, unearthing ancient philosophies, texts, and scientific ideas that had been long neglected or suppressed. One of the most striking features of the Renaissance was the renewed interest in classical philosophy. Thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, whose works had been largely ignored or misunderstood during the medieval period, were rediscovered and brought into the intellectual fold. The humanist movement, which was at the heart of the Renaissance, placed a strong emphasis on the value of human experience, reason, and potential. Humanists believed that the study of classical texts would lead to a more enlightened, well-rounded individual, and they encouraged the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, not just as a means of religious or political control. This intellectual shift gave birth to a new vision of humanity, one that was more focused on individual achievement and the exploration of the natural world. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo epitomized this new spirit of exploration. Da Vinci, with his fascination for both art and science, embodied the Renaissance ideal of the Renaissance man. His works, such as the Vitruvian Mantuan and The Last Supper, not only revolutionized art, but also reflected his deep understanding of a natural world. Da Vinci's notebooks, filled with sketches, observations, and inventions, represent the extraordinary breadth of knowledge that Renaissance thinkers sought to reclaim. He didn't just paint. He sought to understand the mechanics of nature, from the flow of water to the flight of birds, blending art with science in ways that had never been attempted before. Similarly, Michelangelo's contributions to art and architecture were monumental, but they also reflected the Renaissance's renewed focus on the human body and human experience. His sculptures, like Fin David and Fin Piety, and his painting of the Sistine Chapel's ceiling, challenged conventional notions of beauty and religious symbolism, emphasizing human form, emotion, and expression. His work marked a dramatic departure from the more rigid, symbolic art of the medieval period, and instead celebrated the beauty of the human body as a divine creation. Beyond the world of art, the Renaissance also witnessed groundbreaking advances in science, particularly through figures like Galileo Galilei. Galileo's work in astronomy, which challenged the geocentric model of the universe, directly contradicted the teachings of the Church. His observations, made with a telescope that he improved, revealed a universe far more complex and vast than the one described in medieval religious texts. Galileo's support of the heliocentric model, proposed by Copernicus, where the Earth revolved around the Sun, shook the foundations of both science and religion. His work marked the beginning of the scientific revolution, which would eventually lead to a complete transformation of how humanity viewed the universe and our place within it. The Renaissance was not just an intellectual movement, it was a cultural and political one as well. As the rediscovered knowledge of the ancients spread throughout Europe, it began to affect not only philosophy and science, but also politics, religion, and art. The shift away from medieval religious control and feudal systems allowed for the rise of new political and economic structures. Monarchs and city-states began to invest in the arts and sciences, recognizing the power that culture and knowledge could bring to their rule. Wealthy patrons, such as the Medici family in Florence, supported artists, philosophers, and scientists, fueling the Renaissance's cultural explosion. However, the Renaissance was not without its challenges. The ideas that were emerging from the intellectual centers of Italy, France, and beyond often clashed with the entrenched religious and political institutions that had dominated Europe for centuries. The Church, in particular, saw many of these new ideas as a direct threat to its authority. Galileo's support of the heliocentric model, for example, led to his infamous trial by the Inquisition, where he was forced to recant his views under threat of torture. His case illustrates the tension between the Renaissance's intellectual revolution and the medieval power structures that sought to maintain control over knowledge. The Renaissance also marked the beginning of the end for the feudal system. As new ideas about humanism, individualism, and governance spread, the old order of knights and lords gradually gave way to new forms of power, forms that would come to dominate the modern world. The printing press, which had played such a key role in the spread of Renaissance ideas, would soon fuel the Protestant Reformation, further challenging the religious authority of the Church and leading to the fragmentation of Christendom. The intellectual revolution of the Renaissance didn't just change how people thought about art, science, and politics, it changed the very nature of human existence. By rediscovering the wisdom of the ancient world and applying it to the problems of their own time, Renaissance thinkers paved the way for a new era of exploration, innovation, and transformation. As we move forward, we'll explore how these revolutionary ideas were met with resistance, particularly from the Church, which saw them as a challenge to its power and control. The tension between the intellectual awakening of the Renaissance and the political and religious institutions of the medieval world would set the stage for conflicts that would shape the future of Europe and the world. Could knowledge itself be dangerous? The battle between ancient wisdom and the Church's control over truth would change the course of history forever. As Renaissance thinkers began to rediscover the lost wisdom of the ancient world, a storm brewed between the new ideas of humanism, scientific discovery, and the rigid religious dogma upheld by the Church. The intellectual revolution that was underway, fueled by a newfound emphasis on reason, observation, and human potential, stood in direct opposition to the authority of the Church, which had long controlled not only the spiritual lives of the people, but also the intellectual and political spheres of Europe. What followed was a conflict that would not only alter the course of thought, but also fracture the very power structures that had defined medieval Europe for centuries. The growing influence of humanism, which placed emphasis on the value of human experience and the potential for individual achievement, was seen as a direct challenge to the Church's teachings. For centuries, the Church had been the sole authority on knowledge, dictating what was true and what was false, shaping how people viewed the world and their place within it. Humanists, however, began to revive the classical philosophies of Greece and Rome, turning away from the dogmatic teachings of the Church and seeking answers in reason and observation. This intellectual shift placed them in direct opposition to the Church, which sought to maintain control over both spiritual and temporal matters. One of the most famous and controversial figures to challenge the Church's authority during the Renaissance was Galileo Galilei. Galileo's support for the heliocentric model of the universe, proposed by Copernicus, which stated that the Earth revolved around the Sun, was a direct contradiction to the Church's teachings, which held that the Earth was the center of the universe. This conflict between scientific discovery and religious doctrine reached a head in 1633 when Galileo was tried by the Inquisition and forced to recant his views under threat of torture. His books were banned, and he spent the remainder of his life under house arrest. The trial of Galileo is often seen as a symbol of the struggle between reason and faith, between the new scientific worldview and the traditional religious view upheld by the Church. But Galileo was far from the only figure to encounter resistance from the Church. Throughout the Renaissance, the Church sought to suppress any ideas that threatened its authority. The Inquisition, an institution designed to root out heresy, became a powerful tool for silencing dissenting voices. Thinkers like Johannes Kepler, Copernicus, and Giordano Bruno, who challenged the geocentric model and the Church's teachings on the cosmos, faced persecution. Bruno, for example, was burned at the stake in 1600 for his beliefs in the infinity of the universe and the plurality of worlds, ideas that contradicted the Church's teachings on creation. These scientific and philosophical ideas were seen as dangerous by the Church, as they not only challenged theological teachings, but also undermined the very foundation of its authority. The ideological conflict between the growing influence of humanism and the Church's control over knowledge was not just an intellectual struggle, it was also a political one. The Church had long held the power to shape the political landscape of Europe, and any challenge to its teachings threatened its authority over both kings and commoners. Monarchs who sided with the new ideas of the Renaissance, like those who supported the Protestant Reformation, risked excommunication and political ostracization. In some cases, rulers who defied the Church found themselves at odds with both the papacy and their own subjects, who remained deeply religious and loyal to Church doctrine. This clash between old and new ideas, between the ancient wisdom of the classical world and the medieval religious orthodoxy, helped to fracture the power structures that had dominated Europe for centuries. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on the value of human reason and the exploration of the natural world, contributed to the decline of the Church's stranglehold over knowledge and political power. The scientific revolution, fueled by the ideas of Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, ultimately transformed how people viewed the universe and their place within it. The Protestant Reformation, driven by figures like Martin Luther, challenged the Church's religious authority and led to the splintering of Christianity into various denominations. At the same time, the Renaissance's emphasis on individualism and human potential laid the groundwork for the rise of secularism, where power was increasingly derived from human effort rather than divine mandate. This shift in thought contributed to the rise of modern political ideologies, including democracy and republicanism, which would later reshape the political order of Europe and the world. The tensions between the intellectual awakening of the Renaissance and the entrenched religious and political systems of the medieval world did not simply fade. They fueled the conflicts of the Reformation, the rise of Enlightenment thinking, and eventually the political revolutions of the modern era. The battle over knowledge, truth, and power was far from over. It was only just beginning. Now that we've seen how the clash between old and new ideas led to intellectual and political upheaval, we will explore how these tensions fueled religious and political revolutions, shifting the balance of power across Europe and beyond. From the Reformation to the Enlightenment, the struggle for knowledge and control would reshape the world order in ways that would resonate through the centuries to come. What if the Reformation was just a religious movement, but the spark that ignited the collapse of the medieval world? The Protestant Reformation, ignited by figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin, did more than challenge the Catholic Church. It fundamentally altered the course of European history, setting the stage for the fragmentation of religious, political, and social power that had been held by the Church for centuries. What began as a theological debate over the nature of salvation and the authority of the Pope would quickly spiral into religious wars, social upheaval, and the emergence of new political powers. The Reformation was not just a revolt against religious practices. It was a challenge to the medieval worldview, one that would forever change the political and religious landscapes of Europe. The roots of the Reformation can be traced back to the intellectual revolution of the Renaissance, which revived critical thinking and questioning of long-established norms. Figures like Luther and Calvin were products of this new intellectual environment, one that valued individual interpretation, the power of reason, and the direct relationship between the believer and God. For Luther, it was the sale of indulgences, the Church's practice of selling forgiveness for sins, that triggered his famous 95 Theses in 1517. He decried the idea that salvation could be bought and criticized the Catholic Church for its accumulation of wealth and power at the expense of the common people. Luther's challenge to the Church was not just a theological argument, it was a direct attack on the Church's monopoly over spiritual authority and its immense political power. Luther's 95 Theses were more than just a critique. They were a call to arms. His ideas spread rapidly across Europe, thanks in large part to the recent invention of the printing press, which allowed his writings to be disseminated far beyond the walls of the University of Wittenberg. Luther's call for a return to Scripture, for the idea that salvation was by faith alone, and that the Bible should be available in the vernacular, resonated with people across the continent who were increasingly dissatisfied with the corruption of the Church. This was not just a revolt by theologians, it was a mass movement that would fracture Christendom and ignite a series of conflicts that would shape the future of Europe. Luther's success also stemmed from his ability to appeal to political leaders who were looking for a way to assert their own independence from the Pope. Monarchs like Frederick the Wise of Saxony saw in Luther's ideas an opportunity to challenge papal authority and increase their own power. The political dimension of the Reformation cannot be underestimated. It was a revolt that allowed rulers to assert greater control over religious matters within their own realms. As Lutheran ideas spread, they gained traction in areas like Germany, Scandinavia, and parts of France, where rulers began to break from the Pope's influence and establish state-controlled churches. This shift from religious authority being centered in Rome to being rooted in local monarchies set the stage for the rise of the modern nation state. Simultaneously, John Calvin, another key figure of the Reformation, pushed the movement even further by developing his own system of Protestant theology, which became especially influential in Switzerland, France, and parts of the Netherlands and England. Calvin's ideas on predestination, the sovereignty of God, and the importance of a disciplined and morally strict community influenced the development of Protestant churches in ways that would lead to even deeper societal transformations. His vision of a city on a hill, a community governed by divine law, was not just a religious idea, but a blueprint for creating a new kind of political and social order. The Reformation, however, was not just an intellectual or theological movement. It was a cataclysmic event that led to widespread political and social upheaval. The religious wars that followed, such as the German Peasants' War, the French Wars of Religion, and the 30 Years' War, were fought over the control of religious and political power. These wars tore apart kingdoms, disrupted economies, and led to immense suffering for the common people. Yet, even in the midst of conflict, the Reformation was changing the very nature of authority in Europe. Monarchs who embraced Protestantism found that they could assert their authority in ways that were previously impossible. In countries like England, Henry VIII's seventh break from Rome and the establishment of the Church of England allowed him to consolidate both religious and political power, further eroding the authority of the Pope and creating a powerful, centralized monarchy. The Reformation also shifted the balance of power between church and state. The Catholic Church, once the ultimate authority in religious and secular matters, now found its power challenged on all sides. The creation of Protestant denominations meant that there was no longer a single, unified Christian church to dictate the terms of religious and political life. This fracturing of Christendom allowed for the rise of secular rulers who could now exercise control over religious matters, creating a new political order where the church no longer held the same sway over kings and emperors. Yet, the Reformation's effects were not limited to religion and politics alone. It also had profound cultural implications. The Reformation encouraged a greater focus on individual interpretation and personal responsibility, leading to the development of a more literate and informed society. As Protestantism spread, the Bible was translated into vernacular languages, making it accessible to people who had previously been unable to read or understand the Latin texts of the Catholic Church. This democratization of knowledge helped lay the groundwork for the Enlightenment, as individuals began to question not only religious authority, but also political, scientific, and philosophical systems that had long gone unchallenged. The Reformation, in many ways, marks the beginning of the end for the medieval world order. It shattered the unity of Christendom, divided nations, and laid the foundations for the rise of modern political systems that would eventually lead to the establishment of nation-states. In doing so, it transformed Europe from a land of feudal allegiances and papal power into a continent defined by religious pluralism, the rise of the secular state, and the growth of political ideologies that would shape the modern world. As we examine the consequences of the Reformation and the rise of new political and religious powers, we can see how these tensions laid the groundwork for the next stage in European history. In the following section, we will explore how these shifts in power contributed to the formation of the modern nation-state and the development of new political systems that would redefine the world order. What if the medieval world didn't simply fade away, but was replaced by something even more powerful? The birth of the nation-state would forever change the course of history. The collapse of the feudal system marked the end of an era, but it wasn't a quiet dissolution. It was the beginning of a profound transformation that would reshape the political landscape of Europe and the world. With the weakening of church authority, the rise of powerful monarchs, and the fracturing of medieval structures, the concept of the nation-state began to take root. This new political entity would emerge as the dominant force in the modern world, marking the shift from a fragmented medieval society to the unified, centralized states we recognize today. The medieval period was defined by the dominance of feudalism, a system in which power was decentralized and fragmented. Local lords held control over vast estates and territories, while kings, though nominally at the top of the feudal hierarchy, often struggled to exert direct control over their realms. The Catholic Church, with its immense influence and wealth, was also a central power broker in medieval Europe, often mediating between monarchs and their subjects. But as the Renaissance and the Reformation unfolded, these ancient structures of power began to erode, paving the way for a new political order. One of the key events marking the transition to the modern world was the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. This treaty, which ended the 30 Years' War in Europe, is often considered the birth of the nation-state system. The Treaty of Westphalia brought about a radical shift in how political power was structured. It ended the era of religious wars that had dominated Europe, and established the principle of sovereign states, a recognition that each state had authority over its own territory, free from external interference. This shift not only diminished the power of the Church, which had long been a central force in mediating European politics, but it also marked the beginning of a new era in which the nation-state would become the primary political unit. The Treaty of Westphalia solidified the idea that political authority should rest with a centralized government, with the power to determine laws, policies, and religious practices within its borders. For the first time, the concept of territorial integrity and sovereignty was formally recognized, meaning that monarchs and rulers could assert control over their realms without needing to answer to outside powers, be they religious or secular. This paved the way for the consolidation of power within the hands of kings and queens, who increasingly began to centralize authority, moving away from the fragmented and decentralized feudal systems that had dominated the medieval world. Monarchs, particularly in France and England, took full advantage of these new shifts in political dynamics. In France, the reign of Louis XIV, known as the Sunday King, exemplified the centralization of power. Louis XIV's famous declaration, "L'état, c'est mon fils, I am the state," symbolized the transformation of France from a feudal monarchy, where power was shared between the crown and local lords, to an absolute monarchy, where all political power was concentrated in the hands of the king. Louis XIV strengthened the monarchy by reducing the power of the nobility and centralizing authority in the royal court, turning France into a powerful, unified nation. State. In England, the process of centralization was more gradual, but equally significant. The English Civil War, 1642-1651, and the Glorious Revolution, 1688, helped pave the way for the development of constitutional monarchy, where the power of the king was limited by law and parliament. By the end of the 17th century, England had established itself as a nation-state with a powerful central government that was distinct from both the church and the feudal aristocracy. The monarchy's shift from absolute rule to a constitutional framework set the stage for the development of modern democratic systems, where governance would be based on laws and the will of the people, rather than divine right or the authority of a monarch. The rise of the nation-state wasn't limited to France and England. Across Europe, monarchs began to consolidate power, centralize their governments, and push back against the traditional feudal system. In Spain, the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, united the Iberian Peninsula, creating a powerful centralized state. In the Holy Roman Empire, however, the fragmentation of power continued, and it wasn't until the 19th century that the region would fully embrace the modern nation-state model with the unification of Germany, the consolidation of power within the hands of monarchs, and the rise of the nation-state also had profound implications for the way political authority was understood. It marked the decline of feudalism, where loyalty and power were tied to local lords and vassals, and the emergence of a centralized form of governance that would characterize the modern world. With the nation-state, power was no longer fragmented among various feudal lords, religious institutions, and monarchs. It was concentrated in a single sovereign entity, with control over both territory and governance. This new political system also began to shift the way people viewed their relationship to the state. The rise of centralized governments helped foster a sense of national identity, as people began to see themselves as citizens of a particular nation, bound by common laws, culture, and history. The old medieval allegiances to local lords and the church gave way to a new sense of loyalty to the nation-state, a shift that would have lasting implications for the development of modern political ideologies such as nationalism, democracy, and republicanism. As the medieval feudal order gave way to centralized nation-states, the very nature of political authority in Europe was transformed. No longer were rulers dependent on the church or feudal lords to maintain control. Now, they held sovereignty over their territories, free to make laws, wage wars, and determine the future of their nations. The birth of the nation-state set the stage for the development of modern political systems and international relations, and the rise of powerful, centralized governments would eventually lead to the political revolutions and conflicts that defined the modern era. As we witness the rise of powerful nation-states and the shifting political structures of Europe, We now turn our attention to how these new political systems laid the groundwork for the modern world order. In the next section, we will explore the emergence of democratic ideals, the rise of capitalism, and the changing nature of international relations as the medieval world continued to give way to the modern era. What if the medieval world never really ended? The power structures of the past continue to shape our present in ways we never imagined. While modern institutions have replaced the medieval systems of feudalism and church control, the shadows of those power structures still loom over our political, religious, and economic landscapes. The influence of medieval governance, religious conflicts, and economic systems is deeply embedded in the modern world, often in ways we take for granted. The transition from a fragmented medieval world to the modern era was not a clean break. It was a gradual evolution, with echoes of the past still reverberating in today's global systems. One of the most enduring legacies of the medieval world is the concept of sovereign states. The idea of a centralized authority, with a clear territorial boundary and the ability to exercise power within that territory, was solidified in the wake of the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, which established the modern system of nation-states. This shift was part of the broader collapse of feudalism, where power had been fragmented across local lords and the church. Yet, the principles behind modern nation-states, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and centralized governance can be traced directly back to medieval monarchies, which, despite their challenges, set the groundwork for a more unified system of rule. The very idea of a nation-state, with its defined borders and central authority, is a direct descendant of the medieval struggle for control and power. Today, the notion of state sovereignty continues to govern international relations, from diplomatic treaties to the regulation of borders and the concept of national identity. In addition to political structures, the role of religion in governance also remains a powerful echo of the medieval period. While the church no longer wields the same direct control over monarchs or everyday life, the influence of religion on politics, morality, and law can still be seen today. Medieval rulers were often seen as divinely ordained, and the church's hand in political matters was unquestioned. Modern political leaders, while not typically claiming divine right, still appeal to religious principles or use religious symbols to legitimize their power, especially in regions where religion and politics are closely intertwined. The influence of religious institutions on laws, cultural norms, and international relations is still evident in areas such as abortion rights, the separation of church and state, and the ongoing conflicts between secularism and religious authority in many parts of the world. The legacy of medieval economic systems also persists today. Feudalism, with its reliance on land and labor, may seem like a distant past, but the basic principles of hierarchical systems of labor and class divisions continue to shape modern economies. The medieval world was largely agrarian, with peasants working the land under the control of feudal lords. While the specifics of land ownership have changed, class divisions and economic hierarchies persist, with labor often still being controlled by systems of power and wealth. Modern capitalism, despite its focus on industrialization and technology, can be traced back to medieval trade systems and the rise of merchant guilds. These guilds, which began as trade organizations, eventually evolved into powerful economic entities that helped shape the economic order we recognize today. The influence of medieval merchant families, such as the Medici, and their role in banking, commerce, and politics can be seen in today's global financial systems, where wealth and power are still concentrated in the hands of a few, often controlling vast networks of resources and capital. Religious conflict, another hallmark of the medieval world, continues to play a significant role in modern politics. The Reformation, the rise of Protestantism, and the subsequent religious wars fundamentally changed the structure of European society. Yet, the religious conflicts that arose during the Reformation have never truly disappeared. Today, conflicts between different sects of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and other religions continue to shape global politics. In some regions, the legacy of medieval religious struggles is reflected in ongoing tensions between secularism and religious ideologies, from the rise of fundamentalist movements to the struggle for the separation of church and state. The idea of religious wars may no longer manifest in the same way it did in the 16th and 17th centuries, but the underlying tensions between different religious and political ideologies still define many modern conflicts. The feudal system, with its rigid social structures, may have collapsed, but the idea of a class system remains embedded in modern society. Whether through inherited wealth, social status, or institutional barriers, modern societies still struggle with the divisions between the wealthy elite and the working class. The medieval notion of land ownership as a source of power has been replaced by ownership of capital, technology, and intellectual property. But the inequality that characterized medieval feudalism continues to shape the world. The struggle for social mobility and economic opportunity, as well as the continued tension between labor and capital, can be traced back to the hierarchies of medieval society. The shadows of medieval power structures are not just confined to political and economic systems. They are also present in our cultural identities and historical narratives. Nationalism, which emerged in the wake of the Reformation and the rise of the nation-state, remains a potent force in global politics today. The medieval world was defined by localized identities, tribes, regions, and kingdoms, where people identified first with their local lord or community. The rise of nation-states consolidated these identities into broader national identities, which continue to influence modern politics, from the desire for independence in various regions of the world to the ongoing tensions between ethnic, religious, and national groups. As we reflect on how the medieval world's political, economic, and religious structures have evolved, we begin to see that the past has never truly disappeared. The power dynamics, conflicts, and cultural identities that shaped medieval Europe are still very much alive in the modern world. The rise of nation-states, the role of religion in politics, and the persistence of class divides all have their roots in the medieval period. These legacies continue to shape the way we understand power, governance, and social order. From understanding the lasting legacy of medieval power structures, we now turn to a final reflection on the figures and forces that shaped this complex history. Their influence, both direct and indirect, has shaped the world we know today, and their struggles, successes, and failures continue to resonate in our modern political and social systems. As we examine these key figures and forces, we will see how their actions, even centuries later, continue to influence the course of history. Who were the forgotten names of medieval history? The figures whose influence shaped our world, but whose stories were erased by time. Throughout this journey, we've uncovered a tapestry of power, intrigue, and influence, woven together by figures whose actions have been largely obscured by the passage of time. The history we know is often told through the lens of kings, queens, and great battles, but the true power of the medieval world was shaped by those who operated in the shadows: diplomats, merchants, spies, and even heretics, who may not have worn crowns, but whose influence was just as vital to the course of history. From the cunning diplomats who brokered alliances that altered the fate of nations, to the rebel thinkers who dared to challenge the Church's monopoly on knowledge, these figures played pivotal roles in shaping the political, religious, and social landscape of Europe. Their names are often forgotten, or their contributions downplayed in the official narratives of history. Yet their influence was immense. Without the shadowy hand of a diplomat like Francois de la Rochefoucauld, or the radical ideas of figures like John Wycliffe or Jan Hus, the course of history might have taken a vastly different turn. Take the case of the medieval merchant guilds, whose power was far greater than most realize. These shadowy organizations, often seen as mere trade unions, controlled the flow of wealth, determined economic policies, and shaped the political landscape of their cities and kingdoms. The Medici family, for example, is often remembered for their banking empire and their patronage of the arts. But their power wasn't limited to wealth. They controlled the political machinery of Florence, influencing decisions on a scale that most monarchs could only dream of. Yet, for all their power, their names and deeds are often relegated to the background in favor of the more glamorous tales of kings and queens. The true legacy of these merchant families and their guilds is a story of influence and power that shaped the Renaissance and the emergence of modern capitalism. Similarly, the spies who operated within medieval courts, gathering intelligence, sabotaging enemies, and shaping the outcomes of wars, remain largely invisible in the historical record. Figures like the Venetian spies who infiltrated rival states and shaped the political dynamics of the Mediterranean had a profound impact on the outcomes of wars and the stability of entire empires. Their covert operations, often conducted under the cover of night, were just as significant as the battles fought on the front lines. Yet, the names of these spies, whose work determined the fate of cities and empires, are largely unknown, their stories buried in the shadows of history. The same can be said for the suppressed heretics, those who dared to challenge the religious orthodoxy of the Church. Men like Martin Luther and John Calvin are remembered for their roles in the Protestant Reformation, but they were part of a larger movement of thinkers who, often at great personal cost, questioned the teachings of the Church. Figures like Wycliffe and Huss, whose works were censored, suppressed, and erased, played pivotal roles in paving the way for the Reformation. Their contributions to religious and philosophical thought were monumental, yet their names remain largely forgotten, overshadowed by the more familiar figures of the Reformation. These forgotten names and figures provide a powerful reminder of the complexity of medieval history. They show us that history is not just about the victors who are remembered in official accounts, but also about the unseen forces that shaped events from behind the scenes. The story of medieval power is far richer and more nuanced than the history books often suggest. For every famous king or battle, there were countless diplomats, merchants, rebels, and spies whose contributions were just as significant in shaping the medieval world. But why have these figures been forgotten, erased, or overlooked? In many cases, it is because the official narratives of history have been written by the powerful those who controlled the flow of information, the ones who shaped the stories we tell. The Church, the monarchs, and the elites of medieval society often controlled not just the politics and economics of their time, but also the narrative of history itself. By relegating the contributions of lesser-known figures to the margins, they were able to maintain control over the historical record, ensuring that their own stories were told, while those who challenged or operated outside their systems were forgotten. As we look back on the medieval world, we are left with a sense of wonder about how much remains hidden in the shadows. What stories have been lost, erased, or deliberately suppressed? What other figures whose names are unknown to us had an even greater impact on history than we could ever imagine? The legacy of these forgotten figures reminds us that history is far more complex than we often realize, and that the true story of our past is shaped not just by the powerful, but by those whose contributions remain in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. In the final reflection, we will explore what this means for how we view history today. As we uncover these lost figures, their struggles, successes, and influence, we are forced to question the narratives we have been taught, and consider how much of the world we live in has been shaped by forces hidden from our view. The shadows of the past continue to influence our present in ways we have only just begun to understand. With this exploration of the hidden figures and forces that shaped history, we now reflect on the larger implications of these discoveries, examining what they mean for our understanding of power, influence, and the narratives we construct about the past. What should we take away from these uncovered truths, and how can we better understand the complexities of history in light of this new perspective? The story of medieval power structures, though often obscured, still has much to teach us about the forces that continue to shape our world today. What if the history we've been taught is only a fraction of the truth? The hidden power that shaped our world is just waiting to be uncovered. Throughout this documentary, we ventured into the shadows of medieval history, uncovering the unseen forces and forgotten figures whose influence changed the course of civilization. From the shadowy diplomats who brokered peace and crafted alliances, to the rebel thinkers whose ideas were suppressed by the Church, to the merchant guilds that controlled economies from behind closed doors, the medieval world is far richer and more complex than the stories we've been told. These hidden figures shaped politics, religion, and culture in ways that remain largely unseen in the traditional narratives of history. The medieval world, with its complex power structures, was not a simple clash between kings and peasants or a static era of castles and knights. Behind the veil of feudalism, an intricate web of influence existed, one that involved spies, diplomats, intellectuals, and economic powers. These figures worked in the background, pushing the boundaries of what was possible, shaping the political and religious landscapes of Europe, often without leaving a trace in the official records. And yet, their impact was profound. Without the work of the hidden diplomats who navigated delicate political landscapes, Wars may have been longer, kingdoms may have fallen sooner, and the balance of power across Europe might have shifted in entirely different directions. Without the rebellious ideas of figures like Wycliffe, Huss, and Luther, the Protestant Reformation and the rise of Protestantism might have never taken place, and the power of the Catholic Church might have remained unchallenged for centuries. One of the most significant revelations throughout this journey is the role of the Church in shaping and controlling knowledge. For centuries, the Church was the keeper of truth, dictating not only religious dogma, but also controlling access to knowledge, determining what could be taught and what could not. But the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the rise of humanism began to dismantle this monopoly on knowledge, with thinkers like Galileo, Copernicus, and Luther challenging the very foundation of religious and scientific authority. In doing so, they exposed the limitations of medieval thought and created space for new ideas that would go on to shape the modern world. Yet, as we saw with Galileo, these new ideas were not always welcomed. The Church's attempt to suppress scientific and philosophical advancements, whether through trials, censorship, or outright destruction, was a reflection of its desperate attempt to maintain control over a rapidly changing world. The power structures we've examined are not merely ancient relics of a bygone era. Their influence can still be seen in our modern institutions, from politics to religion to economics. The centralization of power in the hands of monarchs and the eventual rise of the nation state were direct descendants of the medieval monarchies, where power was slowly but surely consolidated, eroding the influence of feudal lords and the Church. We also see the long-lasting effects of medieval economic systems. The medieval merchant guilds, for example, laid the foundation for modern capitalism, and the ways in which merchant families like the Medici controlled both wealth and politics are mirrored in today's global financial systems, where wealth and power are still deeply intertwined. But the true significance of this documentary lies in the realization that much of the history we've been taught is incomplete. The official histories have often overlooked or intentionally erased the contributions of the figures we've uncovered, those who wielded influence from the shadows, whose stories were suppressed because they threatened established power structures. The Church, the monarchy, and the elites of medieval Europe had a vested interest in controlling the narrative of history. By focusing on the victories of monarchs and the grandeur of battles, they were able to erase the contributions of the rebels, the heretics, and the intellectuals who shaped the course of history in quieter, more subversive ways. Take, for example, the case of the merchant guilds. These organizations were among the most powerful forces in the medieval world, yet they were often relegated to the background in the telling of history. The Medici family, though they have gained more recognition in recent years for their patronage of the arts and their banking empire, were at the heart of Florence's political life, manipulating power and wealth in ways that shaped not just Italy, but all of Europe. The influence they wielded went far beyond finance, and their power dynamics laid the groundwork for the development of modern capitalism. But how many history books have you seen that focus on these unseen power brokers? Instead, we've been taught about kings and queens whose power was often more ceremonial than actual. Similarly, the role of spies, those silent manipulators of history, has often been relegated to the realm of espionage thrillers and spy novels, rather than taken seriously as a key component of political strategy in the medieval world. Venetian spies, for example, were instrumental in maintaining the Republic's dominance in the Mediterranean. They were the unseen architects of political decisions that would influence the course of empires, yet their names are seldom mentioned in history books. Their work behind the scenes, collecting intelligence, sabotaging enemies, and manipulating allies, was just as significant as the battles fought by knights and generals. This documentary has also shed light on the intellectual rebels of the medieval world, figures like John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, and Martin Luther, who risked their lives to challenge the Church's monopoly on knowledge. These figures were often demonized by the authorities of their time, branded as heretics and excommunicated, but their ideas went on to reshape Europe. The Reformation, fueled by these early thinkers, was a direct result of their challenges to the status quo. Yet, despite their profound impact, their stories were often buried under the weight of the official narrative, which was determined by the Church and its allies. The rebellious spirit they embodied, the desire to question and to seek truth, was dangerous because it threatened the very foundation of the established order. As we reflect on these revelations, we are left with a profound sense of awe and curiosity. How much of our history remains hidden? What stories have yet to be uncovered? And what figures, long forgotten, continue to shape the world in ways we can barely imagine? The forgotten names of the medieval world, those shadowy diplomats, rebellious thinkers, and powerful merchants, have left a legacy that continues to influence our world today. Their actions, often unrecognized, laid the groundwork for the political, economic, and cultural systems that define the modern world. The mysteries of history are far from solved, and as we uncover these lost figures, we realize that the full story of our past remains just out of reach, waiting to be uncovered. What we have learned is only the beginning of a much larger journey, one that will continue to challenge the narratives we have been given and force us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the forces that shaped our world. The legacy of medieval power structures is not just a relic of the past, it is alive in our political systems, our economies, and our cultures. The figures and forces that shaped the medieval world are still with us today, and understanding their hidden influence can help us better navigate the complexities of the modern world. History, it seems, is not a static thing. It is an ongoing narrative, shaped by the forces we uncover and the stories we choose to tell. And as we continue to uncover these hidden truths, we may find that the past is not as distant as we once thought, but still very much alive in the present.